You may have been like me. You may have seen the editorial over the weekend from a newspaper editor. This fellow is saying in his newspaper that it's really great to have Bo Bergdahl home, and of course, we don't know if he's guilty or innocent of what he's been accused of. But the big thing is he's home. And I thought as I was reading that, yeah, but 6 to 8 people, at least 6, maybe 8 people didn't come home because of him, and it completely left out of this guy's rationale that he published on Sunday. And I saw that and I said, I've got to talk about that on Monday morning. We will, but a little bit later in the program. Because in the meantime, I have some other things that are coming up. First of all, Randy Staples will join us in half an hour from the Idaho Weekly Briefing. He's going to be talking to us about some goings-on, not only in Boise, but among some members of our congressional delegation in Washington, and the sad story of a local newspaper that has tossed in the towel and basically is saying they're done after being in business well over 100 years. So some details on that are coming up a little bit later too as well in the program. But first, I was looking through the material I had for the show today, and there are a lot of things I could talk about right off the beginning here, but I was really disturbed by something that started to grow over the weekend. It's metastasizing, if you will, like a cancer. And that would be the attacks on the state of Indiana, its legislature, and its governor for the passage. By the way, 19 other states have similar laws. Nobody has raised any ruckus about 19 other states. President Clinton presided over the passage of a freedom of religion law back in 1993 on the national level. In fact, he had the help of a co-sponsor in the House at the time by the name of Chuck Schumer, who was now railing against the Indiana law. In other words, Mr. Schumer decided to check his direction on the wind, wetted an index finger, held it up in the air, and things are different today. So today I'm going to say this, where 22 years ago I said that. I was among what I'm told is a tiny fraction of people who went to church yesterday. It was Palm Sunday. You're not going to see the hordes come out until, the people who come twice a year and think that that's a big deal. It'll be packed on next Sunday morning when it's Easter Sunday. But you didn't really see a huge turnout yesterday for Palm Sunday. But I'm told that I'm in a diminishing demographic, and that are people who actually go every week or more often, and people who actually believe. In fact, at the Washington Post this morning, I was looking at the website, and there was a comment from a fellow on the website that said that those of us who actually believe in God, believe in the Bible, and go to church, that we're practicing fairy tales. So their view is, we're practicing fairy tales, we should be stopped. That should come to an end, and that we should no longer have the ability, as they say, to discriminate against other people. Look, if you seriously believe as a Christian that if you actually bake a cake for someone who's having a same-sex marriage, or you have to take their photographs, that you are then colluding with what they're doing, and you believe so much of the literal interpretation of that Bible, and it doesn't have to be completely. A lot of people, sola scriptura is their guiding focus here. But here's the thing: it still says in that book, and they make it very clear in Leviticus and a number of other places. You'll see it in Romans too. It comes up again in the New Testament. If you believe that this is going to imperil your own soul, then you should have the opportunity to opt out. And I brought with me today, I'll hold it up to the mic so you can all see it, a copy of something called the Constitution of the United States. And when it was first put out, way back in the late 1780s, someone decided, in fact, a fellow by the name of James Madison, who really is the father of this entire document. Madison decided at the time that we needed a Bill of Rights, and these are not given to us by government. His point was, and it was accepted by the people who ratified this document at the time, that these rights come from God. The Creator was the word often used by the founders, but the Creator, that would be God. God has many different names around the world. The Muslims call him Allah. In English, we call him God. The founders were calling him the Creator. But they enumerated these God-given rights in this document, which I know liberals out there may not understand this. This document is still in force. It is still in effect. And the very first amendment the first of those 10 in the Bill of Rights, actually contains 5 distinct liberties. And you know what? At the top, the very number one point is 5 liberties contained in the First Amendment alone. And number one, take a listen to this. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There you go. Free exercise thereof. It doesn't say freedom of worship. It says freedom of religion. Now, there were states that had official churches as well following this. Congress being the federal government. The federal government said it would back off, that there would not be a state church. But for those of you out there, I keep hearing these arguments from the people. I almost let something slip there. Good thing we have a delay monitor. The people on the left who keep saying, well, separation of church and state. Find that in this document. Find that phrase, that actual quote in this document. I challenge you. You will not. It's from a letter from President Jefferson to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, many, many years later. It has absolutely nothing to do with this document, and it has no force or rule of law in the United States. It is simply a letter, a historical document, sitting somewhere in a museum today. It's just like those people who try to claim we need to open the borders to just hordes of illegal immigrants because Emma Lazarus wrote a poem, and that is now chiseled on the base of the Statue of Liberty. It is a poem. It is not in this document, the Constitution of the United States. And I bring that up. You see, for the American left, because they're now saying that if we have religious faith, we're engaging in fairy tales, they apparently feel that that negates this Constitution and this First Amendment and this first liberty guaranteed of 5 in that First Amendment. That is what they believe. So therefore, this doesn't matter anymore. They would simply, if they had their druthers, you know what they would do with this? They would take this document and they would shred it. And they're doing it right now. They're making every attempt possible to eliminate this document from our lives so that they can rule over you by whatever they feel they should do that morning when they get out of bed. It might change tomorrow. It might change the day after. They like to tell you that it's a living, breathing document. In other words, how can we best rip the pages out that we don't particularly like? Because somebody's feelings somewhere might be hurt. Look, if somebody won't bake you a cake, go down the road and find yourself another cake baker. That's the simple way around all of this. And again, freedom of religion. It doesn't say freedom of worship. From the leftist perspective, they'll say, well, all right, you get an hour every week where you can go into that building and do what you please. But when you come out, then you have to check it at the door. This document does not say that. We live what we believe 7 days a week, whether we're inside that building or we're outside that building. It's 8:15. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. You can reach the program by calling me at 736-0300, 38 at our studios, and you're up next on News Radio 1310, KLIX. Well, that was a quick call. See, I always figure those people either got their question answered or I made the point for them, and so they no longer need to chime in at this point. If you'd like to reach me this morning, though, that number is 736-0300. That is 736-0300. You can also send me an email at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. That is bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. This morning, the Daily Caller has a list of all the various Hollywood celebrities chiming in, claiming they're going to be boycotting Indiana and how awful the people of Indiana are. Seth MacFarlane, the creator of Family Guy, one of the dirtiest shows on TV. Ellen DeGeneres, George Takei. Well, these people already belong to a certain element, so we can understand where they're coming from. Mark Ruffalo, Ashton Kutcher, yeah, another genius from Hollywood. Tim Cook from Apple Products. I guess I won't be buying any more of those. Mark Benoit, is that how he pronounces it? Bill Osterly, Max Levchin, all of these Hollywood types. Because they're in Hollywood, I guess that means we have to listen to them? They must know more than the rest of us? Is that how that works? As they're shoving more cocaine up their noses and divorcing, 6 or 8 wives? You're up next. You're on Top Story with Bill Colley.
No, Bill, it's because they make a lot of money. My deal is, who is more prejudiced the person that for his religious beliefs doesn't want to take a picture or make a cake and says it boldly and outright, or the person that feels like they have to legally force someone to do something they don't want to do.
Well, we go back to, and I've used the analogy before, the French Revolution. After the revolution was finished and the group of leftists had taken control of the country under the guidance of a fellow named Robespierre, they decided that certain people were not following directions quite the way that they envisioned people following directions. And at that point, they decided they had to start forcing people to do things. And the people who resisted got their heads lopped off. We are very quickly headed in that direction in this country.
Well, my big problem is they don't understand. With all the problems we've had in the black communities and everything else, the more they riot and the more they send people to court, the more people are going to come across as prejudiced than not, because they're being told they have to be open-minded, but yet the people that are telling you that are not.
And I'm going to add to that, when we mentioned black Americans and the like, when that topic comes up, and we keep hearing that this is that the liberals are all claiming, well, it's just like back in the 60s when someone refused service at a lunch counter. I've talked to a lot of people from black churches who tell me that there is absolutely no moral equivalence between the two. The color of your skin is something you cannot control. On the other hand, you can choose to keep your fly up. These are actual matters that I think that these distinctions that somehow get lost on all of these people on the other side. They just do not have an ability to understand. Well, if you believe that it's all just a magic or that it's all just fairy tales, then you think the rest of us need to be educated and that you have to save us from our ancient and rather backward beliefs, right? That's the whole point about the American left, is that they have appointed themselves the smartest people in the room, and if the rest of us do not cooperate, they plan to penalize us. Well, you're going to find, if Christians really would like to start standing up, you're going to find the jails fill up really, really fast with Christians. I tell you, though, a day is coming when there will be a backlash. In France, 100,000 Christians were slaughtered. They rose up against this tyranny after the French Revolution, and they were slaughtered. This story never really was reported until really in the last couple of years. Historians started digging up the facts of all of this. It happened in Spain. That's why you had Franco come in and clean the mess up. I'll tell you what, if Libby keeps pushing this, we'll end up with an American Franco, and Libby will find himself on the receiving end, and Libby won't like it. And Libby has no means of defending himself because he doesn't believe in the next amendment, number 2. 820. We may be fast approaching that period in this country, an irreparable split, and it won't be pretty. 38 at our studios, Bill Colley with you. More on this topic coming up in just a couple of minutes on News Radio 1310 KLIX. Church I went to a couple of years ago decided it wanted to see a movie. We decided as a group called For Greater Glory. And the movie is set in Mexico in the late 1920s when a president took over the country and he was anti-Christian and again thought it was all superstition and fairy tales and that they had to eliminate it from public life. You understand Mexico being still to this day a very Christian country, mainly Roman Catholic, but also a very strong Pentecostal influence as well. We had to actually set up a deal with the movie theater. The movie theater refused to book this film because the woman who ran it was extremely liberal. But my future brother-in-law, he at the time worked for the outfit that owned the movie theater, and they managed to rent us a room. You had to go up a stairway and went into this small room with just plain white walls. They took an old-fashioned screen out that you actually pull out of a cylinder and you hang it up in front of the wall, and then we were able to screen the film there in folding chairs. But the film is based on true stories. And the people who were actually involved in this fight in Mexico, many of them who died very horrible deaths. One was the story of a little boy who was forced to walk on glass and then killed by the government, who was later honored by the Roman Church. And you understand, small children were being killed. Priests were being killed. There is a scene in the movie where a representative of President Coolidge is going to visit Mexico to see if he can try to bring this thing to an end. And as he's on the train going through the country, he sees Christians hanging from telegraph poles, one after another, just as he's going down the railroad tracks, and he's absolutely stunned and just horrified by the scene. There was a priest, and he's not really referenced much in the movie, a Jesuit by the name of Miguel Pro. This was a fellow who decided he got the calling late in life, and he ended up becoming a Jesuit, ended up having to live overseas for a number of years, but decided to go back to Mexico. He was then accused, was later determined falsely, that he was involved in an assassination plot. And the government thought, we'll execute him, but we'll also photograph the execution, so we'll send a message to those other Christians. And just before Father Pro was killed, he got down on his knees and prayed, stood up, turned around, with no blindfold, looked at his accusers, and shouted about his faith in God. And he threw out his arms to his sides, thrust out his arms. In one hand was a rosary, in the other hand was a crucifix. And he stood there as if he was on the crucifix, arms splayed to the sides, and he was shot and killed. Well, they thought he was. He didn't actually die right away. So a soldier walked up and shot him while he was still on the ground and alive. And then they published these pictures, and the interesting thing was, it did not chill the uprising by the Cristeros, as they were called. These were the believers. In fact, it only inflamed them more. And eventually, the government had to back down, the president was ousted, and the rebellion came to an end, but the rebellion made its point. And I think in this country, we are fast approaching a day when we are going to be treated that way if the American left remains in control of certain institutions. The courts right now are a very, very dangerous matter. We may have both houses of Congress, and we believe that a Mitch McConnell and a John Boehner would support these issues. Boehner claims, by the way, that he's a very devout man. You may have, in 2016, a Republican elected president. The problem is the court systems are filled, still packed with old Clinton appointees and now Obama appointees, and we are going to have to deal with these people for a very long time to come. I do believe, though, that the day will follow. The day will arrive when they order someone to go out and start arresting these Christians and these people, objectors, if you will. You will find that there are members of police forces across the country and even folks in the military who suddenly say, no, I am not going to follow your orders. And then we're going to have a massive nullification of these court decisions. And I see that coming. That is a prediction I will make. And at that point, we'll start to turn things back around and we'll reinstate traditional values in this country. Tim Cook is the man who took over for Steve Jobs at Apple. They gave him a couple of pages today in the Washington Post. He says there's something very dangerous happening in states across the country. A wave of legislation introduced more than 24 states. Of course, 19 of it already, Indiana's being the 20th, would allow people to discriminate against their neighbors. What a bunch of hooey. Discriminate against their neighbors. Again, if you want someone to bake you a cake, go down the street and find another cake baker. There are so many people out there baking cakes and taking pictures. You will eventually find someone who will agree to do it, and you don't have to force them to violate your their conscience. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to force them to do it, because what you actually want them to do is to join in. I am reminded, what is it? Genesis 19:5. Bring them out so we may know them. We're dealing with that currently, and this is where we are getting highly off the rails. And we have to draw the line at some point. We have to learn that we can fight back. And for all those people out there who say turn the other cheek, they don't know much. The liberals who tell you that may be the only thing they've ever heard or they know from our holy book. But there are plenty of instances in history where we have fought as a group to protect our faith. And we're getting to that point once more. I've got a break coming up. Look, we'll talk more about the subject if you are so inclined. I do have a lot on the table this morning, a lot of things to get to. I hope you can stick around. Randy Staples will also be coming up a bit later in the next half hour. It's 8:30 and 38 degrees at our studios. I'm Bill Colley. Do I need to say at our studios? It's not actually that cold inside. But, hey, I'm warming things up. Plenty more coming up in just a moment. I wanted to note there's a breaking news headline. President Obama is going to be visiting Kenya for the first time as president. I guess he's going home. Also, at Fort Meade, someone tried to ram a gate this morning. No success, by the way. Funny thing about that, the people who actually are standing at the gate are heavily armed. So trying to break through the gate can actually be, how shall we put it, lead to your quick demise. Also, I saw something the other day online. I was looking, what I do is, with most of the shows that we air on Top Story, when I'm done actually with each show, I sit down and I edit a YouTube video, which is a record of the program. And we post those. You can find those at Top Story in various places, YouTube, even on our website at newsradio1310.com. And every time the subject of these issues comes up about Christians having to put up with people telling them, you will cooperate, you will do as we say, and you will violate your conscience because it'll make us all feel better about ourselves, there is some woman who always says, give it a rest. She just keeps commenting, give it a rest, give it a rest. In other words, how can we best silence you people who will not follow our program or our plan or our design to turn America into one great big Sodom and Gomorrah, which is what they are really trying to do. 8:35, Bill Colley with you. 38 on our program this morning. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. The media's gotten on board. Hollywood's gotten on board. They're all distorting this bill. They all are trying to make it sound as if it's the very first time anything like this has ever passed. As I pointed out at the beginning of the show, Democrats way back in 1993 were all on board with these types of laws to protect religious conscience. Here's another point to be made, though. You get right back to the original ideas of this country. And first of all, we have to have a business license, so we are subject, if you are a business, to having to deal with all of this. Well, but if I don't get a license, I can't do business. That's true. The argument being, once you enter into that licensing agreement, you have a contract with the government. So therefore, you have to serve anyone at your lunch counter. You have to bake a cake for anyone who demands a cake. You have to take the photographs for anyone who demands the photographs. Rand Paul caught heck a couple of years ago when he told Chris Matthews on MSDNC that he did not support the 1964 Civil Rights Act for one valid reason. And he said, because if you don't want to serve someone because they're too tall or too short, or that really doesn't, just because it may not be nice, doesn't make it illegal. And Matthews was all enraged, and it spread through the community on the American left about Rand Paul must be a racist and a bigot, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But he was trying to point something out. Why would you want to actually go eat somewhere where someone doesn't welcome you? In other words, go somewhere else. If you, in fact, I've used the analogy before. If someone won't serve a particular group of people, somebody else will, and they'll make a lot of money doing it. We have a caller with us. You're up next on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
You know, Bill, I think the big thing is they need to have an open mind and live the American dream. If nobody wants to service that market, guess what? Then there's a market to be taken.
Absolutely. And thank you for the call. It's one of those situations where people tend to overlook that, and that you can make scads and scads of money if you choose to follow that path. And again, if I walked into a restaurant and they don't like me, I don't know that I want to eat there, even though legally I can go in there and eat. I just find the arguments we're hearing on all of this are just empty, because this notion that we have to have everybody be nice to each other. Did anyone see the story on page A3 of the Times News yesterday? College of Southern Idaho, a nursing professor is teaching a course in civility because we need to be nicer to each other. If I send my kid off to college and I'm paying a fortune and we're borrowing $100,000 over the course of 4 years or more, and they're going to come out of college with a mind full of this stuff, and they don't know yet how to actually go do anything productive in the economy, what's the point? What they mean is they want to silence dissent. They want everybody to be a liberal. They want to turn America into one great big Barney show. I love you, you love me, we're a great big family. Somebody hurt your feelings. Oh, baby bop and I will bop them. 2 plus 2 is 4. 2 plus 2 is 4. Coming up on 8:39, Randy Staples will join us in a few minutes from the Idaho Weekly Briefing. A lot to talk about going on in state government, as well as what activities are taking place in Washington with your federal congressional delegation as well. And he's written about that. in this weekly briefing. In fact, the updated briefing that I happened to see this morning. So some of those details are coming up in just a few minutes. But you know what? We've reached a point in this country where you cannot look cross-eyed at someone, or they're going to lock you away because somebody else got their feelings hurt. Well, we used to be a tough country that used to win wars, and we hacked out trails through the wilderness, and we spread sea to sea. We wouldn't be able to do that any longer, would we? Because somebody somewhere would be hurt and pout, and so therefore the rest of us would be told to cease and desist under penalty of the law. Coming up on 840, Bill Colley with you on Top Story today on News Radio 1310, KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com, which means you can listen to us anywhere, all over the world. If you're traveling out of town and you'd like to keep track of what's going on back home, that's the best way to do that. Randy Staple is coming up in just a short while here on Top Story. Wanted to mention our good friends at Western States Bus Services, where they are now hiring part-time bus drivers, split shifts 5 days per week, summers off and scheduled no school days. Pay is $10.75 per hour. By the way, you can apply today by contacting 733-8003. That's 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. At this time on Monday mornings, we like to sit down for a few minutes and chat with Randy Staples from the Idaho Weekly Briefing. We're doing that again today. It's 39 at our studios. 844, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. And first of all, Randy, welcome back to the show.
Well, thanks for having me back.
You had a very touching story today about a newspaper, a weekly newspaper not far from here, that is going to be closing down simply because, of course, there's really no one left, I guess, at this stage of the game to actually operate it. That would be the Buell Herald, and you have a long-time relationship with them, a business relationship as well. It sounds as if people are going to be losing their voice in that community.
Well, I think that's true, and I think it happens really whenever small town newspapers go away in that way. Buell has been able to communicate with itself through the newspaper for a century and more now, and so have a lot of papers. A few decades ago, nearly all small towns had their own newspaper in place, and now if you look, for example, around the Magic Valley, once the Buell Herald is gone, other than Twin Falls, there are papers left in Burley. There's one that's sort of based in Fairfield. There's the Ketchum paper, but that's about it in the whole Magic Valley. And I remember 25, 30 years ago, there were about a dozen papers scattered around the Magic Valley. 2 separate dailies, a whole bunch of weeklies. Pretty much every county, except possibly for Camas, had its own newspaper, and that's changed a lot. And people's really ability to communicate in their community has I think been scrunched a little bit. We have social media and things like that to pick up some of the slack, but it's not really quite the same. And I was thinking of a time one of my former employers told me. He said that if anybody survives in the newspaper industry, it will be the weeklies, because you can see the Little League pictures and the local Rotary pictures and the various banquets and get those details. But it oddly enough, it seems that, as it turns out, that those smaller weekly newspapers are the ones that are actually folding up and going out of business. Well, some of them are. Some are continuing to hang in, at least so far, reasonably well. It might have been that if there had been another specific individual person at Buell that wanted to step up and take over the paper, that maybe it would have continued on for quite a bit. A couple of years ago, another newspaper guy, former newspaper guy, he's still in newspapers, and I decided to kind of survey the newspapers around the Northwest, the dailies, weeklies, pretty much everything, and find out what was happening with them, a little bit of their history also, but also what they're doing now, how they see their future. And a lot of the weeklies, those that weren't kind of bought up into larger groups, a lot of the weeklies were maintaining reasonably well. There are a bunch of them around Idaho that are still small, independent weeklies that are very determined that they're going to hang in there for a long time, and maybe they will. But the pressures are difficult. There are a lot of weeklies that have gone away, and it's I think it's really a sad thing.
In my hometown, the one family had controlled the weekly paper since just after the Civil War, and about 25 years ago, when the fellow who was still publishing it, and he must have been about fourth generation, when he realized that his own children had no interest, they were going to go to college and move away, that they had no interest, he ended up selling it to a large chain, and now it's a county paper. It really doesn't have the same feel because you don't have that almost mirror that's turned on that local community every week.
It's a very specialized kind of thing. It's newspapers are businesses, of course, but community weeklies like this are a very special kind of thing. They take a very specific kind of personal touch, and it's difficult for a large company that has lots of them around the country. In Washington State, for example, there is one newspaper company, and actually that company is based in Canada, owns between 30 and 40 of the weekly newspapers in Washington State. There are plenty of cases like that, but there's certainly not a lot of community feel to them. A lot of these papers are put out of common offices, often far away from where the newspaper theoretically is based and covering. And there's a lot of the community feel really does go away when you run into that.
Our guest is Randy Staples from the Idaho Weekly Briefing. We're coming up on almost 8:50 and 39 at our studios. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. On another note, you were writing today I was reading the details about U.S. Senator Mike Crapo talking about budget deals and the like, and of course they're exuding with optimism about all of this in Washington. But as I was reading that, I thought of two things I read before I even left the house this morning. Number one, Al Hunt has a piece at Bloomberg. He says it assumes $1 trillion in unspecified budget cuts and another $1 trillion from revenue generated by the Affordable Care Act. He says although the Republicans would eliminate that, that word assumes is always big in this. It assumes we'll see this. And then number two, Robert Samuelson at the Washington Post says what consistently unites Democrats and Republicans is their common capacity to lie to themselves, lie to the public, and postpone any serious discussion of the central issues of government spending and taxes. So you've got a lot of people patting themselves on the backs right now saying, hey, we've got these deals. This will be great. This is going to turn the corner. But two of the leading columnists in the country are saying, whoa, wait a minute here. Do you think that they may be onto something?
Well, they could be. These things are very easy to fall apart. There's a little bit more push, and I think a little bit more willingness on the part of more individuals in both chambers to try to do a little bit more now than there was. There's a bill that's of great importance to a lot of rural communities in Idaho, forest payments bill that would help local schools, a lot of local governments. That seems to be getting through now where it wasn't in the last few years. So there's some possibility there, but it's very shaky ground. The point you were making about assumptions, I think, is a pretty significant one, because the assumptions that are underlying the ideas behind the Democratic and the Republican proposals in Congress are very, very different. They're suggesting that each of them are suggesting different kinds of long-range numbers, long-range impacts for various budget items. And when you can't agree on what the actual figures will be, then you almost just have to put that to the side and say, well, we're not going to think about that for a while, and go on from there. And it becomes a very shaky ground to try to develop a firm long-term deal with. They may try, because there's some real interest in trying to avoid government shutdowns, things like that. They may try and just put a lot of that to the side and try to find ways to, in some ways, kick the can down the road.
In other words, someone else picks up the mess. Hopefully, we'll be out
eventually.
Right.
Eventually, yeah.
Government, of course, in Washington operates a lot like government in Boise. It's slow. We think deliberative. We've got a couple of issues still on the on the burners at the in state government. It seems that we may have an agreement on teacher pay increases, and we may be getting closer on a transportation bill too, although it may not be anything that was originally floated or anywhere near that as well.
It's getting closer. The budget efforts by the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee, which drafts the budget, comes up with the budget bills. Those are largely done now, and generally once that's done, the legislature will usually adjourn within a week or two, because that's about the amount of time that it takes to run those bills at normal speed through the House and through the Senate. So I think there's probably an awareness that there aren't very many days likely to be left in this session, most likely. But there are still a few things that can hang them up. I still look at the whole road funding issue precisely because of what you mentioned, that is not on the level, on the scale that the governor and that a lot of other people were talking about earlier on in the session. I can imagine that coming back to kind of stick them and be a very rough patch in the road for these last few days.
Our guest is Randy Staples from Idaho Weekly Briefing. It's coming up on 8:54:39 at our studios. This is News Radio 1310 KLIX, and you're listening to Top Story with Bill Colley. The teacher bill, which I thought looked pretty well like a done deal, and it looks as if it's going to be signed by the governor. I did not realize until I really looked into this in a little depth, is that it can always be pulled again if we have issues with revenue in the state. In other words, it for people who think this, especially in the teaching professions, that, wow, this is a guarantee, this looks great. If a year from now or a couple of years from now there's an economic downturn, the whole deal is off.
Oh, yeah. And that's largely true for almost any kind of agreement that way. No legislature in that sense can bind a future legislature. The next legislature can always undo something that this one does. About the only exception to that would be if a constitutional amendment were passed, and that were passed in addition by the people. But just about anything that the legislature does could be undone a year from now. And I suspect that the teachers are well aware of that possibility, but they may be banking on a couple of other things. One being that the economy continues to do reasonably. What allowed it this time was the fact that the economy was continuing to generate enough tax revenue that they could move ahead on some of this stuff. And the other part of it was simply the idea that maybe once it gets built in, it may be a little bit more difficult to cut away over time. But you take what you can get, and after a lot of years of not getting very much, I think they were happy to get something.
And in fact, I was thinking about that word assumption again. They're going to avoid that, because what they're saying is, look, we don't know what the future holds, so we will tie this to whatever changes occur. Unlike Washington, maybe there's a difference between what happens in Boise and with the federal government.
Yeah, it's well, there are plenty of counterparts to that, of course, in Washington and federal payments. There are cost of living adjustments and things like that occur as well. But sure, I think that it's going to be pretty closely tied into whatever happens economically, to whatever the revenue picture looks like in coming years. And any deal that's made now can certainly come undone in years ahead. But I suspect that as long as this kind of a relatively favorable deal is on the table, the teachers will be happy to take it while it's there.
Randy, for people who'd like to read up and get some more detail, where do they go to look at your website?
They can check out www.ridenbaugh.com. That's RIDENBAUGH.
Before we wrap, I'll do a John McLaughlin. Any predictions?
I think the odds are probably better than even that the legislature has more than a week left in it, but it's pretty close odds.
All right. Well, I thank you very much. We look forward to we'll tee it up and do it next week. Who knows? They may be there a very long time.
Maybe not. We'll see.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Take care. Randy Staples joining us this morning from Idaho Weekly Briefing. You're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you. One more hour of Top Story is still coming up. Hey, we're up to 40 degrees. That sounds chilly, but when you hear the overnight lows coming up in the next couple of days, here we go through this beautiful, beautiful winter and the early part of spring with these wonderful, unseasonable temperatures, and all of a sudden we get to the month of April. You're not going to like what you hear when we talk about some of those overnight lows that are pending a little later this week. And we will have a big cool down in the middle of the week before temperatures finally start to rebound toward the end of your working schedule. Today, though, is going to be a great day with a high temperature in the mid-70s. No complaints. News coming up next from Fox. That's on the way at 9 o'clock. And, of course, Rush Limbaugh following news at 10 o'clock right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. There would appear to be, among America's leftist newspaper editors, a schism right now about what to do with this story of Haley, Idaho's Bo Bergdahl, the man who has now been charged with desertion for leaving his post in 2009 in Afghanistan, where he was serving with the U.S. military and then spent 5 years with the Taliban. He says, by the way, he was being tortured the entire time. Some people are shedding some doubts on that. That may be the defense that he is going to try to mount when he actually has to appear before a military tribunal. But I wanted to share with you a couple of different thoughts on this particular story this morning. 7 minutes after 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. And you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com online, which means you can hear us anywhere all over the world. 40 at our studios. Wall Street Journal's James Taranto, who hails from a place called Endicott, New York. It's spelled Endicott, like in the shoe company, the former shoe company, Endicott Johnson, but the people who live there. I worked there in television for a while, and just outside of there in a place called Binghamton. And Endicott was one of the suburbs. James Taranto is a native of that small community, and he's writing in the Wall Street Journal that something fascinating is going on in this Bergdahl story, and he says that the American left would just simply like it to go away at this point because of the embarrassment it's going to cause their leader in the White House. And he says the New York Times actually has already in an editorial presumed that Bergdahl is guilty, which he says is fascinating enough in itself. But he said then the Times also asked for a leniency for Bergdahl. The editorial's headline is "No Need to Prosecute Sergeant Bo Bergdahl." The Times concedes that as a general matter, the American military has good reason to punish service members who desert, but asserts that this is one of those extraordinary cases that merit an exercise of discretion. The bulk of the editorial is a brief for the defense in which the editors cite two mitigating factors. One is that Bergdahl claims to have endured brutal treatment at the hands of the Taliban. The other is that he probably never should have been allowed in the military in the first place. The writer goes on to say the Times editorial admits that 6 soldiers died hunting for him after he went missing. Didn't mention that. Well, like it didn't happen, right? And it may be 8. We shared with you some comments from a man who served with Bergdahl last week who said, yes, 6 from their unit, but another 2 from a nearby unit who may have lost their lives as a consequence of this. And Taranto goes on to say rebuilding their lives isn't hard. It's just impossible because, of course, they're never coming home alive. It appears, he writes, there is real disagreement over the facts here. Resolving such disputes is the purpose of the investigations and trials. The Times editorialists perversely want to shut the process down in order to spare Bergdahl, even though they think he is guilty. What could possibly explain such a bizarre position? He says, well, Times editorials are frequently bizarre, but that just begs the question. And he said the most obvious answer is that the editorial's real agenda is political. In other words, protecting Barack Hussein Obama. Once again, you've got people in media who refuse to do the jobs that they were trained to do. Now, speaking of all of this, this is a copy of Sunday's Times News from right here in Twin Falls. I had to spend my hard-earned cash on this so I could read the 3 local stories and then the editorial page as well. And whenever I read this editorial page, I wonder what planet these people are living on. In fact, if you'd like to know more about my thoughts, I've actually written them down. You can find them at our website also at our Facebook page. Our Facebook page is News Radio 1310 KLIX, the website being newsradio1310.com. It's a commentary, and the headline is The Times News, Pompous Liberals, and Insufferable National Debt. Now, the editor-in-chief of this newspaper, he's returned to Twin Falls after having left town for many, many years. He has returned to Twin Falls, and normally what he does is he sits here and explains to you how they make the cartoons every week, or why they use black ink for most stories instead of red or purple or something like that. But he says that the people of Haley, Idaho are petrified and living in fear because they have been threatened for their support of Bergdahl. Really? Is there somebody flying over in large jets, ready to drop bombs on them? Well, no. But, there's some anecdotal evidence that someone may have received a nasty or curt email from someone around the country upset with the welcome they gave Bergdahl once he was initially released. But that's all they have. He doesn't specify what these threats are. He just says there have been threats made against certain town officials. So in other words, some angry guy who was ticked off that we traded 5 Taliban cutthroats to release this guy who may be a traitor, that we traded 5 Taliban cutthroats and that 8 Americans may have died in the search for Bergdahl, likely wrote someone at the town hall in Haley and said something not very nice. Okay, I got it. Somebody's blowing off steam on the internet. Gee, that's never happened before, has it? But then he goes on to say, I don't know whether Bergdahl is guilty or innocent, but isn't it good that he's home? Well, wait a minute here. Good that he's home. Again, 6 to 8 people he served with never came home alive because of his actions. And you know what? I was talking to some people that I know the other day, and some coworkers, in fact, and somebody said, well, it's a shame if he was actually tortured by the enemy once they actually picked him up while he was out wandering in the hills. But, on the other hand, it may have been justice. And if he was still with them, it still would be justice, most likely, at this point. And for all we know, he had actually gone native and joined up with them. And at the end, may well have been hoping that they didn't release him, knowing what he was going to face, because you see the picture of him as he's being loaded in a chopper. Just beforehand, he's wiping away a tear. Now, that could be a tear of joy, but it could be one of fear about, I got to go, pay up now for what I've done. And I think that we're missing this whole point. This notion that, isn't it great that he's home? Why? Why? If he did these awful things, why is it great that he's home? And we now have to spend money to go through. And by the way, it's not a military trial. It's not a court-martial coming up right away. We may never get to that point. There's going to be a hearing which is reminiscent of a preliminary hearing in the civilian courts. And it may be determined at that point that nothing's going to happen and they release him. So that'll be the end of it, right? At least from a military perspective. The debate will go on among people in this country for years to come. But what you're seeing here is an effort to try to whitewash this whole situation. And this notion that it's great that he's home, a lot of people out there don't think so. They don't think so whatsoever. Every time I read these dang newspaper editorials, and they always make these claims, they'll say things like, well, it's the right thing to do. Who gave you that ability to make that judgment for everyone? Because, frankly, I don't recall that, you were born with some special powers, or that someone granted you special powers to make these choices and these decisions. It doesn't happen. There were some other things I found, too, as well in the newspaper over the course of the weekend. On the front page, there was a big story about businesses coming to Idaho because Idaho is such a friendly place for businesses. You don't have a lot of regulatory hurdles. Of course, you've got cheap electricity. You've got all sorts of water running over waterfalls in various places. In fact, I drove up to Boise the other day and saw all of the whirligigs spinning around in the high winds. Thought they were going to pull right out of the ground and fly away. The wind was blowing at such a nasty pace. We'll talk about energy in a couple of minutes, but so for the front page of the newspaper, you want to talk about a contradiction, to report about how all of these companies would like to come here and do business, and many of them are coming here and doing business, and yet you go to the editorial page, and all they do is whine, cry, and stamp their feet about how nasty and mean the Republicans who run Idaho happen to be. Except, of course, they've provided jobs for people who are desperately in need of work. And I comment about this in that piece I wrote for our website and on Facebook. And I mentioned a famous line, in fact, from Margaret Thatcher, and I've linked a video from Margaret Thatcher speaking in Parliament, answering a charge from one of her opponents, who says that the income levels among the rich have soared in the country while she was prime minister, and she points out that everyone's income levels soared while she was prime minister. And she says, you know what? They would rather have the poor be poorer as long as the rich weren't as wealthy. And that's what you have among these editorialists at this local newspaper. One of them claims the Tea Party is over. He goes on to say he's got, because Mike Simpson, who, I'll tell you right now, I lived close to Washington for the last 7 years of my life. I was there frequently on either business or for other events that I was taking in. And I know a lot of people who work there too as well. I have a friend of mine, he was from high school. He was the chief of staff for a congressman for many, many years. Mike Simpson is an absolute nebbish. He is a zero. He is a non-factor in Washington. He is a lickspittle for John Boehner. That is all he does. That is his complete M.O. But because he opposes Raul Labrador, all of a sudden the Republican Simpson is a hero at this newspaper. And they're saying, well, the Tea Party is dead. Funny, I was reading some liberal columnists over the weekend at much larger newspapers, and they may be at larger newspapers because they may be far more talented than the people who are writing for the newspaper here. And they're saying the exact opposite, that this Tea Party thing isn't going away. In fact, I referenced Al Hunt. Of course, he was for many, many years, I believe, with Gannett, now with Bloomberg. And he says the Republican right hasn't gone away, and he says, in fact, it is only getting stronger. And all the evidence is that the Republican right is getting stronger at the local level, at the state level, and eventually at the national level. Well, look. 2010 and 2014 were certainly fine examples of that happening. There's a lot of wishful thinking going on among liberals in this country, and they seem to think that everybody else out there really is a closet liberal, and of course, in their little bubble, they only talk to fellow liberals. They somehow believe that everybody else out there who is opposed to them is just a small minority. Have I got news for them? If the trends continue, and the Republicans win the White House next year, and I think we have every reason to believe that they will, when you've got the leading candidate from the other side, apparently did a Richard Nixon, or worse than Nixon, in essence burned the tapes of her perfidy when it comes to her email server. We've got a pretty good shot at taking the White House as well, and we may take it with one of the far-right candidates. You're up next. It's 9:18 on Top Story with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX. What's on your mind?
Well, speaking of the presidential election, Ted Cruz, I mean, he is such a quick wit that it's going to be hard to pin him down, and he doesn't have any dirt in his history. And Rubio is almost as quick as him, and he's such a great speaker. Both of them are. Those two alone in a debate are going to be hell for anybody else to beat. When those two debate each other and whoever else, Scott Walker, that is going to, I would think, attract one hell of a lot of attention. And so the field we have is so, man, it is full of studs. And so I'm very encouraged. And so just a statement. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the call. And in fact, one of these writers was saying that these Tea Party candidates aren't going to go anywhere in the Republican primaries. Let me tell you something. Right now, other than Jeb Bush and Chris Christie, the other dozen or so Republicans who may be the nominee will very much have the backing of the Tea Party movement. That's pretty much a given at this point. And right now, Bush may be leading in certain polls. Well, that's because he's the most familiar name. Things are going to change relatively fast once we get into January of next year. Bill Colley with you. Hey, I've got more coming up. Some thoughts on renewable energy on the way. 41 at our studios. It's 9:20. You're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX. I wanted to mention, if we could, coming up Wednesday on the program, we are going to be joined by the good folks at Tripp Family Medicine. The program is Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. And we sit down with the doctor or a physician assistant or nurse or someone from the staff on a weekly basis and have a discussion about your health. And we take your telephone calls, too, if you're so inclined to join in and maybe pose a question or a comment or seek a little medical advice, this is an opportunity to do that. We'll be discussing issues important to you and give you, the listeners, an opportunity to call in with your questions this Wednesday. And, of course, the doctor was saying the other day he'd really like to hear from moms out there because, of course, they're often the ones bringing the children to the doctor's office. And specifically, what is it that they'd like to know when he's on the air, that he could better share some things with them. Tune in each Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. for Better Health, brought to you by Tripp Family Medicine in Twin Falls, across from the post office on Fillmore Street, because life's too short not to feel good. Also, Western States Bus Services is now hiring part-time bus drivers, split shifts. Now, they will train you as well. You can walk in there, and they will train you how to operate one of these very large machines. Split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. The pay is $10.75 an hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Saturday morning, I drove to Boise in what I would call a very strong windstorm. I say that because when you're driving down the highway and you feel as if the wind is going to push you off the road consistently, and it looks as if the hood of your Jeep is going to just pop off, it starts to rattle and you can actually see it shaking with the wind, it gives you the impression right away that you're in some nasty weather. Luckily, when I got to Boise, the wind died down, and on the trip home, I didn't have any of those issues. But if I could tell you very quickly, I was watching those giant, you see them on the road, those giant pinwheels that are supposedly out there generating electricity for us. I was watching those as I was driving along and thinking that they were going to just fly away. The wind was that strong. But how many days do those things actually spin around? And when they're not spinning around, do they actually generate energy? I had a friend who was in the oil industry many, many years ago, and he was an oil engineer, and he used to explain to me that they actually have in some of those windmills, in those big turbines, little engines that will turn them when the wind isn't blowing in order to give the impression that they are actually, because they don't want the public to get the idea that they don't always work. You see how that goes? I saw something at the Washington Times today, pulling the plug on renewable energy by a writer named Sterling Bennett. And he says we've been sold a bill of goods for 50 years now. Talk about that a bit later. But we have a telephone caller with us, 42 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story, News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. You're up next at 9:27.
Good morning, Bill Colley.
Thank you.
I just want to commend you on the little speech you gave before the break. You were 100% right on, spot on, buddy.
Thank you. Once in a great while, the stars align, and I happen to do that.
Talking about the Tea Party, I'm a member of the Tea Party, proud member. And yes, there's only two candidates on the Republican side that is not Tea Party backed, and you named them. You were right on. As not just that, but everything you said was right on.
Super.
We're on the same page, you and I.
Well, I thank you very much. Look forward to seeing all of you at one of the next rallies.
Okay, great.
Hey, take care. Thank you very much. I had mentioned it before. I was at the very big rally in Washington in 2009 when we had 1.5 million people out on the National Mall, stretching all the way back. In fact, a friend of mine got up into the top of the Washington Monument, took pictures, stretching all the way back from the lawn of the Capitol to the Washington Monument. And when we sang the national anthem at 1 o'clock that afternoon, it was one of the most incredible things because the people in the back of the crowd obviously couldn't hear what was going on at the stage by the Capitol. So they picked up the song as they heard it coming back through the crowd. And when it finished, I was standing there with my friend Chuck Bettyman. Chuck used to be a disc jockey in Philadelphia known as Chucky B. And I was standing there as well with my friend Colonel Steve Heil, who called the program the other day, just on Friday, I believe it was. And we were all standing there together. And all of a sudden, we heard the last few bars of the Star Spangled Banner echo back at us after we'd finished. It sent chills up our spines. It was amazing. You may recall the media tried to downplay it by claiming there were only 70,000 people there. Well, we had a park policeman who was standing there with us and a couple of guys from Capitol Police chatting with us, and they told us at noon they estimated 1.2, and at 5, and they don't release official estimates anymore because Louis Farrakhan got angry with his 80,000-man march when he claimed it was 1 million, and he sued them. And then at 1 o'clock, they told us that there were 1.5 million of us there. That 70,000 figure actually comes, there's a small area called the Federal Triangle, and we were all getting off the Washington Metro there, and we were gathering at the Federal Triangle to march down Pennsylvania Avenue. Well, it got so packed there, they panicked. The fire department had us quickly move down the street. They actually had us march down the street an hour and a half earlier than we were supposed to. And it took 3 hours for that procession to move all the way down to the Capitol building. That ain't no 70,000, my friends. That's 1.5 million. And then there were people who couldn't even get beyond the barricades after a while to make it to join us. So that movement is still strong. It's not gone away. And this notion that somehow it has, it's just, again, wishful thinking on the part of the American left, who seem to believe that we're all going to turn this, as I say, into one big sort of sexual bacchanalia and have a great future in this country. Man, are they misguided. I've got more coming up on renewable energy in just a moment on News Radio 1310. I knew the president of an electric co-op where I used to live. In fact, we got to be pretty close friends because he did a weekly radio show with me, and we still are in touch every now and then. And I remember him telling me that the co-op had this huge solar farm, and it had these giant pinwheels that were spinning around, and there were proposals to build more. And he one day told me, though, flat out, he said, because we have to have them. We're forced to have them. We don't necessarily like having them. We feel we could do much better by generating electricity in more traditional forms. However, we're told that we have to do this by government. Government says it will save the planet, but it's going to cost you 3 to 4 times as much for your electricity by the time we're all done with this. Government thinks that's okay with you. The reason people in America can't afford retirement any longer is because of all the expenses they have paying all of these new bills that are presented to them, so these liberal pipe dreams can go forward. 9:35, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Rush Limbaugh will be coming along in about 25 minutes, right after Fox News at 10 o'clock. 42 at our studios. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. H. Sterling Burnett, writing today in the Washington Times. Who is H. Sterling Burnett? A research fellow on energy and the environment at the Heartland Institute. And he says, renewable energy mandates require utilities to provide a certain percentage of the electric power they supply from renewable sources. That would be solar and wind and the like. Notably, he says the required percentages are rising over time. It's a bit like these people who tell you ethanol's good in your gasoline, and then they want to raise it from 10% to 15% to 20%, when all it does is corrode your engine and ruin your automobile. And that's simply because the very first presidential primary is held in Iowa, so it was decided, well, you know what, we'll get those people on board with us by going ahead and we'll be burning food in our cars. The reason we had these Arab Springs and these riots all over the world were because of food shortages brought about by the U.S. production of ethanol. Did you know that? That has been a proven fact. That has been a proven fact. And yet we have all of these people chasing all of this around when we simply just need to be concentrating on, in order to keep this economy going, or maybe reviving this economy, on getting back to some basic common sense. He writes, for 50 years, green energy gurus in industry and the environmental movement has sold snake oil that renewable power would soon be as cheap and reliable as coal, oil, nuclear, and natural gas. And he says the nation has been told the turning point has always been just around the corner, always requiring a little more public funding and tax breaks before we have abundant, cheap, clean, reliable energy materializing from thin air. And you know what they're doing? They're turning around giving those tax breaks to all of the friends of the presidents, Democrat presidents. That's how that works. It's, in other words, rewarding them for all of their campaign contributions. See, legalized bribery is a great way to make money back in tenfold. We have a caller with us. You're on the air on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com.
Yes, good morning. I have a fairly simple question, but it's not a simple answer, I'm sure. My question would be, when will it be, or what will it take for the American people to finally say enough is enough and impeach this guy?
Well, he'll be gone by the time anybody gets the wherewithal to try to even force that to happen. Simplest answer. He's gone in 2 years, right? In less than 2 years. Unfortunately, he may ruin the world by then, allowing Iran to put together its nuclear arsenal and start firing it all over the Middle East and perhaps beyond. But hey, you know what? A lot of Americans went out there and they bought this notion that Santa Claus was coming to town. We have another caller with us. You're up next on News Radio 1310. News Radio 1310 KLIX. I got my tongue back in joint. What's on your mind?
Does that, Bill?
What's that?
I'm not the only one that does that. Hey, I'm glad to hear you talk about ethanol. That is the junkiest stuff. It'll knock out your fuel pump, your catalytic converter. It's terrible. And I cannot believe people are not yelling about it.
Ted Cruz went to Iowa and said, sorry, I'm not going to buy into this.
Right.
They may not like it, but he's telling them, you're ruining the country here and you want it for your own personal gain. Let's start talking about what we have to do and sacrifice as Americans.
I went out to the fairgrounds, and they had it was a Republican congressman out there. I don't remember what his name was. And I started yelling about the ethanol, and there was a farmer standing behind him. And I was telling him all the bad stuff about ethanol. So, well, we got to use it. And the farmer looked at the congressman and goes, this guy's right. We cannot use it in our tractors.
Obviously, he's not growing a lot of corn, though.
Right. Thanks, Bill.
Hey, thank you for the telephone call. In other words, my special interest trumps the future of the country. That's what's going on with many people in Iowa right now. But again, we're burning food in automobiles. And that food could have been feeding people in Egypt and Libya and all of these places that have had, because most of these Arab uprisings started as food riots because there was a tremendous run-up in the cost of food. When are we going to learn that we are cutting off our noses to spite our faces in these situations? 20 minutes away now from 10 o'clock. Also, Mike Huckabee coming up in 10 minutes, right here on Top Story, on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you for a few more minutes, and of course, Rush Limbaugh following news at 10 o'clock. I was just looking at my Fox TV monitor a minute ago, and there was a debate going on. Tammy Bruce from the right and Skullface, what's his name, Alan Combs from the left. And they were having a debate about Bashir Assad, who, of course, who's the leader of Syria. Second generation, his father had the job before he did. And they are Baathists, which means their party is a nationalist party. It is not an Islamist party. And in fact, that's how Saddam Hussein got started as well. His party was more nationalist than it was religious. 2 years ago, I wrote a blog post. In fact, I mentioned my friend Colonel Steve Heil, who, as I say, called the program last Friday. The two of us used to maintain a blog. And I wrote a blog post for that situation in Syria where I said we needed to get behind this guy Assad. And the reason was the people he happened to be fighting were the same type of people who had taken over in Libya and for a brief time in Egypt and who are trying to take over now in Yemen and who are controlling this group called ISIS. Now, I got a lot of flack for doing that. People were saying, oh, he's just a mean guy and he's doing these terrible things to his own people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. No, he was doing it to bad guys. You got it? To really bad people. Now, the argument has morphed from the American left and from many politicians in Washington, and they say, well, he was fighting people who really had a legitimate beef, but they're not ISIS. No, now he's got two enemies. No, he doesn't have two enemies. They've created that myth. He's got the same enemy he had 2 years ago. They did not split, or another one didn't show up on his doorstep while he was fighting the first one. That's just Washington trying to cover its butt because we wouldn't get behind the guy in the first place. He's trying to keep a lid on a very bad situation in that part of the country. We may not like the way he governs. We may not like the way Saudi Arabia governs. We may not like the way this El-Sisi fellow in Egypt governs. But you know what? They're doing us a big favor right now. The Iranians are not. These guys are doing us a huge favor. We tend to overlook that because people in Washington are constantly, as I said earlier in the program, they're wetting an index finger and seeing which way the wind is blowing. And then when the direction changes, they're scrambling to come up with some sort of cover story. And that's what they've done in Syria. You've got the Obama White House, which created that crisis in Libya, where they now take Christians down to the beaches and behead them. You nearly had Egypt go that direction before El-Sisi and his people got involved and took control again. You've got the Saudis in the middle of all of this who are being pressured by Iran and being pressured by us, apparently, because we are promoting people who would like to knock them off. I don't like the way they run their governments, but you know what? We don't tell them, or they don't tell us how we can run ours, or if they did, we wouldn't pay any attention to them. And if the day comes where people get too sick of it, you will see some people who actually have some righteous motives come forward and topple the government. But in their culture right now, most of the people who live under it are pretty much fine, especially in Saudi Arabia, where you may not like the fact that your wife has to walk around town dressed in a tent. She doesn't have to do that at home. But the government gives you a fat check every month because of the oil revenue that comes in. So why are we constantly trying to micromanage the situation? I guess we aren't any longer, which is why the Saudis have created, did you know they recruited the Pakistanis and the Turks to even get involved with them? So Mr. Obama, meanwhile, continues to sail down that ridiculous primrose path, and he says we'll have a deal with Iran and everything will be hunky-dory. But meanwhile, all of these other people in the Middle East and in parts of Asia are now organizing against them. He may be the most, what's the word I'm looking for? The dupe that leads us into World War III because of all of this. And yet you still have people in media who just cannot break away from their idolization of that guy. And as the caller said earlier, he'd like to see him impeached. It will not happen. It will not happen. And again, we're only down to about 22 more months or 21 more months of the guy. But you know what? Can we survive it if he figures out a way? There's a glitch right now in the nuclear deal with Iran. They've walked away from the table. Get it? They've walked away from the table. So watch him come back and try to give them something else that threatens our security. Can we survive the next 21 months with him at the helm? That's going to be the question. 9:49 coming up in just a moment. Mike Huckabee. The Huckabee Report is brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. You can reach them at 736-6563. Once again, that telephone number is 736-6563. I saw a video over the weekend, Mike Huckabee being interviewed by Bill Maher on the Bill Maher program on HBO. And I thought, oh no, this is not going to go well at all. But you know what? Huckabee managed to hold his own in that conversation. Maher is one of those people who doesn't believe, of course, in God. And he thinks that those of us who do are all a bunch of freaks and that we're stupid and that, again, they need to force us into following their beliefs. But still, Huckabee held his own, and I was proud to see that because the governor has taken it on the chin quite a bit from mainstream media, especially over the last 6 months because of what he believes in. And I'm glad that he's holding to his beliefs and he's not trying to turn around and appease anyone. Because we already have one appeaser in office, we certainly don't need a string of them. Huckabee on the way, and of course then a few closing thoughts from me, Bill Colley. You're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And of course, Huckabee straight ahead. Thank you very much, Governor Huckabee. When media attacks him, of course, they do it because he will not play along with the liberal game, and they believe somehow that even our religious faith should be Democrat Party. And he just will not go along with that, and they can't seem to quite understand that as a Baptist minister, he might see the world slightly in a different way, but I'm glad that he does hold to his, or stick to his guns, if you will. 9:54, in fact, a big story at the Washington Post is railing against all of the Republican candidates for president who actually own guns. Yes, what a nasty, nasty thing. Some of these people actually know how to use them as well. It seems that at least in the Republican Party, the next time you see someone out to actually trap or shoot skeet shooting, excuse me. Been one of those mornings, hasn't it? That's why we call it Monday. The President of the United States, you may remember those photographs of him at Camp David. First of all, he hates going to Camp David. That's not his type of place. But somebody pointed out, they said, you can't hit anything firing level. Somebody at the White House went, oops. But you've got people in the Republican Party who know exactly what they're doing. Mike Huckabee and Rick Perry and several others would know exactly what they were doing out there when they were on the range. 9:55. In fact, speaking of that, I've got a very nice email from somebody inviting me to an event in Jerome this coming weekend, and we're going to try to get them. It involves firearms. So the Liberals can stay away. That's fine with us. No one really wants to talk to them as it is. Hopefully, we'll get someone on the air with us before the end of the week, and we'll be talking about that event. Quickly, to wrap up before I get out of here today, just a couple of quick notes on what I was talking about a few minutes ago about the potential for a big, wider war in the Middle East. There is a fellow who made an appearance on TV over the weekend with Chris Wallace, and he is Obama's former ambassador to Iraq. And he said, we have some major problems that we are dealing with, and here we are talking to Iran about a nuclear deal with this almost complete breakdown of order in the Middle East. He went on to say one of the things that we have to keep in mind on Iran is also a country with ballistic missiles, cyber capabilities. They are also still a state sponsor of terrorism. And here we are dealing with them as though we're going to give them carte blanche. That's from a former ambassador who worked for Mr. Obama's State Department. He's an intelligence officer in his past life, so he might actually know a little bit about what he's talking about. And then a fellow by the name of Walter Russell Mead, who I believe is considered to be a fairly liberal writer, had a piece at American Interest the other day, and he pretty much says, he quoted James Jeffrey, Obama's another former ambassador, cutting through the commentary on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East with a certain pithiness. We're in a blank free fall here. Now you've got the former director of the Defense Department, Leon Panetta. You've got the former secretary, or director of the CIA, rather, that is, and that is General Petraeus. They've come out. They both worked in the Obama White House and with President Obama. They both say this is a bad idea. Then why in heck are we still going through with that? Where is there any ability of anybody in Washington to get the attention of these people, grab them by the collar and shake them and say, no? Well, if you do, they just turn around in establishment media and say that you're a racist. Although it's okay to go and attack Israel. You're not considered a racist if you're beating up on Bibi Netanyahu. 10 o'clock news straight ahead from Fox, of course, and Rush Limbaugh following that. Sean Hannity following 1 o'clock news. Glenn Beck following news this afternoon at 4 o'clock, and Dave Ramsey a bit later tonight. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. God willing and the creek don't rise, I'm back in this chair tomorrow morning. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. That means you can hear us anywhere online, all over the world.